Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Chiara, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you. Yes, it's a pleasure for me as well. Thank you for inviting me. So basically, I am. My name is Chiara Thumiger, and I am an historian of ancient medicine and a classicist. And I work in Germany, in Kiel and Berlin. And my interest is basically on a variety of topics, but I'm very interested in history of psychiatry and history of mental health, history of the body, ancient Greco-Roman medicine, but also comparativism when it comes to medicine, and more recently on the history and the anthropology of guts, so the inside of the human body, especially with regard to digestion and nutrition, and how this was conceived in the past in connection with the mental activities, and how this resonates or has parallels with more recent neuroscientific topics such as the gut-brain axis and all these kind of reflections and discoveries about how nutritional aspects and dietetics have to do with the health of the brain and in our mental life.
I want to talk about the guts first, because that's even a kind of I wouldn't say it's a controversial subject today. It's just there's a lot of people that are trying different diet plans. There's always new science emerging. And I think from a lot of maybe people in the US, from the general public, kind of saw a couple of years ago, there was this gut brain connection. And it led me to curiosity of like, has that always been there? I mean, everyone kind of talks about like, your diet, whatever you're eating kind of ends up becoming who you are in a sense. Whether it makes you feel good and it's linked into emotions in some way. I'm just curious if you could take me through maybe a brief kind of introduction for someone who might be brand new to the topic.
Yes, thank you. Well, basically, when it comes to the most recent medical neuroscientific, developments about this topic, I must come clean. I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so I might end up saying many silly things. The understanding that I have of it is pretty much the one, I suppose, of the general public. So the way I would summarize it is that it is now not only confirmed by impressionist guesses or just something we feel about this, that what we eat and also the state of our digestive system and our metabolism has a very strong impact and sometimes direct influence on subjective mental states, or more generally the kind of mental health also in the neurological sense. This is not necessarily not only our emotional states or our conscious mental life, but also the state of all our functions that have to do with the brain and with the state of our neurological health, so to say. So in more precise, to give a couple of examples, it is obvious that dietetics, what we eat, and also the way we digest and we process food have an impact on the state of health of our mental state of health. And there are mental disorders that also depend on the way one eats and the way food is processed by the body, basically. So this is, I think, the general understanding in terms of the contemporary discourses in medicine. What I am more interested in is the kind of parallels that you find to these ideas in ancient medicine. And if this is more the topic of my research, more than the modern part, which is, from the way I understand it, very much a work in progress. And I think it is also one of the most financed and quickly developing kind of topics in neuroscience at the moment.
When it comes to just the ancient parallels, I would say, I mean, did they have a clear understanding? I mean, as much as probably not as much as we know now, but I feel like if they gave somebody a herb or if they gave somebody some type of form of medicine, whatever that they were using, I don't know if they knew the full chemical reactions that went into what was actually happening in that person's body that might be able to fix the problem that might be happening in the person's mental state. I feel like with just newer technology, you probably understand it better, but I'm also very new on the whole ancient world's form of medicine. I think as far as I can go back, it's probably the Old West, where they were like, you need a chicken, like as a dentist or something like that, where they have a chicken plucking at your teeth. So if I'm curious, when it comes to the ancient kind of world of medicine, did they have a decent understanding? Like, were some of their ideas of it based more on, like, if we take the example of the history of madness, a lot of that can be chalked up to maybe some religious things, people kind of being insane. Was it more of an inner conflict in between somebody's soul? And now we have more of a diagnosis of, like, is there something going on in somebody's brain?
Yes. Well, of course, many things in this from this factual point of view were different. So there is no doubt about that. And there are particular instruments of diagnostics or or kind of biochemical understandings of the body and insight in the microscopic that we have and that is factual, you would say, that wasn't, of course, available before the very recent times. So this is probably the most important difference that you have between the understanding of the body that and the knowledge, if you will, of certain measurable aspects of the body that we have now and that they had in the past. Now, when you say decent understanding, this is a very, typical, normal way of putting it when you talk about ancient science or ancient medical science, particularly. But it is, of course, a kind of, the risky way of looking at scientific systems, especially medical, different from our own, in the sense that, of course, every system, medical system, work within its own context. And so, in that sense, when it comes, for example, to ancient pharmacology, you can well say that a variety of the recipes that they used made no sense. Some of the ingredients really read like magics or just, nonsensical accumulation of ingredients. But then there is a lot of research being done very recently, in particular, that I am aware of, to try and reconstruct the ancient recipes. And in many cases, there are ingredients that are known to be active, from honey to garlic to a variety of other, plants and so on, that were very active. In some cases, more dangerous than beneficial. But anyway, it is a matter of ongoing research based on observation of certain results and the attempt to reproduce these results. Sometimes there are associations, sometimes there are magical religious aspects, but it is, of course, a kind of magmatic, combustion of elements that then slowly develops into a purified direction when it comes to the specifics maybe of pharmacology or biochemistry only. But there are to medicine many other elements that are those of the, looking after the body or the health of the body and mind in general, not only as a matter of chemical reaction. So this means that when you talk about, for example, ancient medicine, and by this I intend Greco, in the case of what I work with, I talk about Greco-Roman medicine, so starting from the 5th century BC to the following 1,000 years, more or less. So this is the tradition I work with. There are disciplines and kind of doctrines that surely, whose efficacy can well be understood by us as well. For example, dietetics is one of the most important, innovative, maybe introductions done by classical medicine, the medicine of the so-called Hippocratic corpus. So this earlier kind of body of texts that we have, and in the texts that talk about dietetics or regimen, so the kind of lifestyle one should adopt, there are many recommendations that make perfect sense. Many that don't make sense to us, of course, but the dynamics and the principles behind them, medically speaking, are as valid as many other, self-help or dietetic recommendations that you can find nowadays. And in particular, the kind of, with a bit of a misplaced word, I could say the holistic approach that in some of these texts is to be found about human health, that put together what you drink, what you eat, but also how much you sleep, what kind of job you do, what is the weather and the environmental conditions around you. So all these contribute to health. So in this sense, you look at the ancient material and how they describe the inside of the body, and this is ridiculous in many cases, no, absurd, or it's very easy to get doctors nowadays to laugh when I talk about ancient texts with them. But there are certain principles and especially certain questions that have remained the same and haven't been answered anyway yet.
Could I ask what some questions that have remained the same are? It's interesting to me that you mentioned, how like diet I'm gonna say that I'm gonna butcher this word, but dietics, like back then, if they're talking about things of that sort, it doesn't matter if it compared to our knowledge today, if it's completely wrong, but just the fact that they were at least consciously looking into different variations and different things about their body and kind of exploring in that aspect. I mean, everybody takes their first step somewhere. So to me, that's fascinating in its own. But some questions that are still kind of remain the same today, you mentioned.
Mhm. Well, it's I just give you maybe the main one that can be rephrased in different ways, and I think yes. So one of the anyone who studies human beings and their health has the questions finds very early on the question, what is the difference between body and mind? So place like this sounds a very plain question, not only for doctors but for philosophers and for in theology or for religious people. This is a fundamental questions because it has to do with the survival, of course, of the body or the spirit after death, and there are different. Ways of rephrasing these questions. Again, religion will talk about immortality of the soul. Doctors will talk about other kind of distinctions that have to do with physiology and human health. But yes, so one question: what is the distinction between health and mind when it comes to the human animal or any animal? Where do you draw the line in terms of accounting for physiology? For example, a person who displays a certain psychopathological behavior, for example, someone who has a problem with food. We are talking about someone who suffers with what nowadays is diagnosed as anorexia nervosa, for example. What would you how would you put the body and mind divide in this person? How would you target the therapy to the body or to the mind? And anyway, where do you place the distinction when you distinguish the two kinds of therapy? What is the cause? What is the effect? So, in that sense, this is a question that was debated a lot in ancient philosophy, biology, medicine, and I don't think it is satisfactorily answered in a univocal way. Today, I don't think, I think this is always the question when it comes to therapy, when it comes to, pharmacology, what kind of therapy is the one that is most important for these people, not only, this example, but any a psychiatric patient. Is it about the chemistry of it? Is it about psychotherapy, family context, socioeconomical factors? So yes, so this is one question that is always there.
Did the
And
ancient,
then
oh, I'm sorry. I was about to say, did
no,
the
no, I
ancient
just said
world,
another example, but go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, well, I would say, tell your example. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, it's we can talk about that later. Basically, another question that has remained the same is the one that opposes or distinguishes between good and healthy, or between bad and mad, or bad and mentally ill. I'm talking about mental health again. So in the history of the classification of mental disorders, for a long time, there were items such as uh, homosexuality, for example, that was included among the pathologies, and there are two problems here, and not so much the fact that homosexuality itself cannot obviously be considered something bad or good, but the very fact that even if that was the problem, or the point about the sexuality of a person, a categorization of morals, whether this could be included into a medical classification. So what is the difference between moral validity of a person and illness or health? So this is another question that has remained, I think, very unresolved.
Both those kind of lead into the question I was going to ask, which was how important are philosophers into the involvement of medicine? Usually, when we think of medicine today, like at least the way I think of it, it's kind of we talk to scientists or researchers that are specifically like psychologists are a good example. Pharmacologists are a good example. I mean, even though they're only studying giving a drug to somebody, but it's doctors in a sense with a stethoscope. But when you think of when I think of philosophy, I don't really think of their involvement in, I guess, medicine at all. But then if we talk about the involvement of philosophers in medicine starting back from the ancient world, I mean, understanding kind of a different perspective that could add into maybe an understanding of treatment when it comes to insanity. I mean, morals always gets linked in. I hate to say it like that, but morals always gets linked in somewhere. I've talked about that with more of modern medicine. Like, what do we view as bad? Like ADHD for the longest time, I have it. It's normal to me, but to somebody else, it's the most annoying thing in the world. And I feel bad for some of my listeners sometimes because I do rant a lot, but there is a subject of morals. Like back in the day, homosexuality was the worst thing possible, and you were infected or you were, diseased with something if you even had homosexual feelings. And now it's a more modern day thing where I start going, what did they label back then? I mean, were they getting insight from philosophers to be able to diagnose if somebody was really experiencing madness, or were they just dealing with some type of loss?
Mm, Okay, so first of all, I think this question is more than one question when it comes to the chronological span that you're talking about, because you ask about antiquity, so 5th century BCE and going, forward. And but then you mentioned the example already where you also talk about philosophy nowadays. So I think very important is to distinguish a different role and different kind of, well, not even only professional but intellectual figure of the philosopher in ancient Greece and throughout the centuries and nowadays or even 200 years ago. So if you talk about the distinction between medicine and philosophy in the ancient world, this is another key topic maybe in the history of the different disciplines that have to do with antiquity. Medicine is born to a great extent, so Hippocratic medicine, with a lot of common dialogue, but also in opposition, or in not in opposition, but in kind of trying to distinguish its territory from that of philosophy. So philosophy as the debate about what is the origin of things, what is the nature of, in an abstract sense, of the living beings and so on. So the search for the principle of life or for the principle of the universe is considered by the doctors that speak in the that are preserved in the Hippocratic corpus as abstract questions that don't have to do directly with the mission of the doctor, which is to understand the human body and try to find solutions for its illnesses and disease and so on. So I wouldn't really think that in any way there is a figure of the philosopher already in the 5th century that can be a point of reference for the doctors to understand how to best go about mental illness. But later on, and I'm talking about the time of Galen, so a few centuries afterwards, the figure of the philosopher is more established as a kind of intellectual figure. And in fact, Galen would say that the good doctor also needs to be a philosopher. So to understand the philosophical tradition, to be able to logically understand the text and express an argument and so on. So there is a development in this sense. When it comes to mental illness, I think the most important thing to notice is that in the ancient material, until really a fairly recent time, you don't have a clear separation between health of the body and health of the mind. So this question that we were talking about earlier on means in medical terms that you have patients that are ill, so they have a dysfunction of the body, and the body is intended as a kind of continuum, as a kind of a whole of mental, spiritual aspects and the actual body in all its parts. And this illness sometimes can manifest itself psychopathologically, so through a certain behavior, through subjective feelings that are negative, through emotions that are obviously out of order. And this is, we can read this text and say, okay, so here they're really talking about something that we would call mania or depression, or it resembles this and that. So we see the psychopathology as readers kind of sometimes projecting our own categories, but I think in a legitimate way. But you don't find in the ancient texts a kind of discussion that says, okay, these are the diseases of the mind with a list, so to say. And these are to be cured with psychiatric measures or psychotherapeutical measures as opposed to something else. So a kind of notion that mental disorders, mental diseases are a category, separate from the others, or special in some way, only comes up later. So I would say, for the record, maybe the first centuries of our era, so in the imperial period or something. But in the Hippocratic stuff, you don't really find any distinction like that. You just find illness with different manifestations, with different, behaviors attached to it.
I would have to think that when it comes to the ancient world, it would be like with diseases. Like if somebody had like, I mean, how would you know what if you had heat stroke if you're out in the sun all day, or how would you know that if you caught some type of disease that maybe wasn't widely known back then, and you just started kind of going insane with hallucinations, rather than like I guess the genetic thing, which is like if you were born with like maybe a disease that they didn't know about back then, like schizophrenia or some type of illness in that sense. I mean, classifying the term mental illness, I would say, is probably where I would try and understand the ancient kind of thought of it, like their own understanding of when did it become, I guess, more aware that there are people that were going crazy, and did they look at it more as like a religious thing? I mean, I hate to use this example again, dumb question, but the oracle thing, like the person that has like visions and stuff, to me that sounds kind of nuts. And that's my own today modern thinking, but I wondered what they viewed it back then, and if it was placed in a different context, like if it was in a different time period and someone was having visions or something like that, would that be seen more down the religious aspect of things, or would it be seen more as an insanity problem?
Well, I think yes. I mean, I think
I prefaced it with dumb question. I said
No, no, it's not a dumb question. It's just that it's a question with many with different aspects. Now, first of all, so a caution. I don't think that things like hallucinations or what you said, the oracles, so kind of ecstatic experiences acknowledged by the person and by and taken seriously by others around, basically of different kinds in religious contexts that are, or even just hallucinations for, but especially the contexts are mystical or ecstatic, so to say, or initiation, so religious. To have an hallucination that is taken seriously by yourself and by people around. Is usually one of these instances that one uses to say the ancient world or a kind of primitive context as opposed to, something that makes sense, which is where we live. But as far as our context, but as far as I know, there are many people who experience, for example, degrees of auditory hallucinations, meaning hearing voices. There is quite a lot of research and literature on this. There are people who live, I mean, nowadays, because I remember, listening to a few documentaries and even communications in conferences about this, people who live with voices they hear. They're not necessarily or mostly not threatening or voices pushing you to do things, but they are just voices that tend to accompany life, and to cast these as necessarily as a sign of schizophrenia or as mental pathology is something that questions a bit our idea of normality. And also these people would resist pathologizing this. Some people would say these keep me company, they're part of my mental life. And so in that sense, I wouldn't really categorize anything that is not completely tangible and normal in our trivial understanding of normality as modern, and everything else as ancient or primitive. Something else is hallucinations, for example, of people who have died recently. One can call them ghosts. Maybe in other contexts, one would call them ghosts, but I know that in terms of mental health, it is relatively common to have hallucinations of people who have died and you're missing a lot. I think this is part of grief, for example. It is something recognized. So in in your, not your, of course, it's what you're proposing for the discussion, but in this categorization, these would also be kind of mental disorders. And I would again resist that definition unless you include grief and the stress of life in mental disorders. But again, it's a line that you might want to place more or less. I think we could be inclusive about that. So in this sense, hallucinations, I think, are part of human life, especially under certain circumstances, which are also normal in human life. But of course, oracles or a kind of regular integration of hallucination or ecstasies into, for example, civic life or religion is, I agree with you, something that we don't experience now. I mean, the ancient world was, in that sense, separating domains in a way that was clearer from the way we separate them now. And so, in this sense, you wouldn't, the doctor would not discuss the oracles, and in the same way, they would not, conceive them or even, possibly include them in a pathological discussion. So you have a lot of description, for example, of hallucinations in the Hippocratic texts, for instance, where hallucinations is obviously described as part of a disorder. For example, there is one case of a disease where the liver becomes swollen and starts pressing against the diaphragm, which is one of the areas of the body that is seen as particularly sensitive for mental life. And as a consequence, the patient starts growing deranged and more and more having hallucinations of scary things like monsters or like armies of people marching against them, against the patient, something like that. Another case, hallucinations of a threatening kind, which tend to happen especially when someone is traveling, so is far away on his own on an empty road. When you have a description of something like this, of course, you can wonder what kind of illness did these people have? Were they simply, for example, far away from home and feeling, yes, desperate or vulnerable or very tired or simply eating new things or not sleeping enough because they were traveling? Were they maybe on a big empty road? And so, sometimes you have this kind of empty field hallucination that can happen when you are in the snow, for example, explorers report, or when you are
Like sea
in
captains,
a,
like when they see the sirens that make them crash into the rocks.
yes, yes, for example, yes, something
So
like that.
it's a big
It could be
hallucination.
something of this kind. Yes, and so they would, and they would think of them and categorize them as, in this particular case, as being pathological events. So in this sense, they would conceive of a distinction between these two. There is a religious context where hallucinations have a certain significance, and then there is the medical context. But I wouldn't so much think that religion is the key to understand some of these. And the discussion about ancient medicine as a kind of reaction or a polemical alternative to a religious interpretation of these kind of things has been the kind of model to read ancient medicine, or the triumph of rationalism against these views where everything is kind of explained with the intervention of the gods. I don't think that this is a kind of opposition that we are very used to, that we are very that is very dear to us. It's a kind of enlightenment view of the intellectual history. Because people would just think that the gods are or demons or whatever cause everything, and then there is a rational approach to it. I think that things were more nuanced in the ancient world, or in general anyway. And so this opposition was there in some texts. For example, on sacred disease is a very famous text of the Hippocratic Corpus that discusses what resembles a disease that resembles very much what we call epilepsy. And this doctor, repeatedly says there are many ignorant, superstitious people who think that when people fall or foam from the mouth, it's because this god or the other goddess have cursed them and blah blah blah. But in fact, we know that this is just ignorance. It's about the brain, and something that goes wrong in the brain and causes them to have a certain reaction and so on. So this was there, this idea that you have to understand the nature of of the body, of the functioning of the human body, of physiology, and so on, and not simply find excuses or think that there is a capricious God that makes strange things happen. But on the other hand, in many other contexts, these kind of explanations or events were completely accepted by the same writer, maybe of the same text. So I wouldn't push this opposition too far.
When it comes to a lot of my knowledge of the ancient world, it's because I have a very big fascination of Greek mythology. So that kind of question was leading into how much that influenced the culture, like with all the gods and all of that. Like I start to wonder, I go, I mean, is this people like looking for an excuse as like a religious answer? That's why when you bring up that answer about the doctor that had a different viewpoint of someone that was foaming at the mouth, not relating it to a god thing, but something that's going on in the brain, immediately in my head I think, did they kill that guy? Because that's just not normal thinking back then if they were going to take a more scientific approach rather than more of a religious perspective, which is what I've kind of viewed history kind of through. I'm not religious at all, but I've noticed a lot of religious influence, and there has kind of been, I think today's probably the more modern sense of like not really, I think there's more people that are not religious, but back then it was largely influenced into the culture. So if you're trying to understand madness, or if you're trying to understand, I guess, the body in a more distinctive way and be able to detail the scientific issues that are going on with it, even with primitive technology compared to the stuff we have today, a lot of stuff would be done through prayer and a lot of stuff would be done this way, which is why I'm interested if there was someone that was thinking differently. I mean, look at dreams. if you had a vision of your dead family member in a dream, we don't think that's weird even today. We go, it's okay, your body's dealing with the process of grief and all this. But if you're seeing a dead ancestor in front of you while you're awake, people are going to look at you a little funky. So, I mean, to me, like, there's just like, does that make sense a little bit?
Um, yes, but again, I think that people would look, yes, but again, I think people would, for example, if you see the dead ancestor, people would think.
Somebody needs oxygen. If you're seeing a dead ancestor, you need oxygen.
Yes, but I do, again, it didn't happen to me with ancestors, but I don't want to trivialize this, but I sometimes see my cat that died a few months ago. And it's not that I see it in an hallucinating kind of way, but probably with the corner of my eye, I just mistake a shadow in the corner for my cat or something. But who knows what the difference is? I am pretty sure that it, and I've heard it from not only from people I know, but there is literature on this, that when you miss someone, when you lose someone, a dear person that you live with, people see this person sitting on chairs around, not for, and it's not I mean, you can call it a ghost, you can call it a memory, you can call it an hallucination. There is surely a neurology behind this, like behind everything, if you will. But I'm not sure that's even a better explanation than saying it is a ghost. But I think that people like to look funky at at people when they talk about their weaknesses. But this doesn't mean that we don't have that these are not as common as they were before, or that they should necessarily be considered something pathological. Now, seriously speaking, so this is again about not summing up modernity. By modernity, I mean, I suppose, I don't know, 21st century urban educated context like yours or mine, I suppose. So not to sum them up as super rational and with such a clear idea of what is healthy and possible and norm and what is not, while in the ancient world or in other contexts, things might be much more mixed or superstitious or magical and so on. I think there is much more hybrid versions of everything. There is a lot of irrationality around nowadays too, in one way or another. I mean, it's there have been examples what could give various contexts, from COVID to all kinds of conspiracies that come to people's mind, educated people. I don't need to give you examples. I suppose we all live in the same world. So I think in the States, there is quite a lot of that too,
I
right?
think our body kind of like there's something about our brain when I start talking like with scientists and researchers who study consciousness. And I'm like, what's consciousness? And they're just, or is unconsciousness. I don't know if it's consciousness or I'm gonna blank. I think I'm even saying the word improperly, but the scientists that I've talked to that try to study the mind, like the inner part of your mind, and I go, what is that? The subconscious. That's what it is. Like if I start explaining a bunch of stuff, they're like, well, we don't know exactly what it is, but there's ideas about what it is. And I'm like, what? We don't have an answer for that yet. And it's kind of like you start even with like seeing a family member on a chair or something like that. It doesn't mean you're crazy. It just I believe that it's the power of our mind is able to do things that we just don't understand. And in a way, not like magical powers or anything, but like if you're subconsciously or you're dealing with loss and you're just pushing it down, you're kind of just moving on with your day. Maybe your brain's just trying to deal with it in a way where it's not going to upset you on purpose, but it's just a way of, hey, you're not right. Like, let's try and go work through some things where like your body heals without you even knowing it. So I think of like ways that your brain tries to bring a lot of these things to the forefront. And I mean, there's a connection there that we still don't understand, but it's just fascinating where I start going, I mean, how many people, whether you were at sea and if you're a guy, if you were married to someone, you miss your family, how many visions did you see when you were and we just relate that to just being on the ocean, that it was the water, we're finding an excuse for that thing happening, which makes it interesting to how people try and solve problems. I mean, do they take a more religious route for it? Do they take a more meditative route? I mean, that area of exploring your mind deeper is still answers that people give today when someone's depressed or someone's stressed out. Like maybe you need to focus a little bit more. Maybe you and I have this theory I'll toss your way, and you can shoot it down if you want. But I thought of like, I mean, how in the ancient world, how big was the culture of this area of philosophy? Where I started going, I mean, if you told someone from like a young age that everything that they did was like the greatest thing in the world, and they were blessed with all these types of insane thinking or these whatever you want to say, revolutionary thinking, would that person form into always trying to reach for the deeper thought? You know what I mean? Like it's like a Truman Show with Jim Carrey, where he's living in a fake world, and they're all like, it's all. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's landed over where you're at. The Truman Show. You've seen it?
Yes, yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So he's in a fake world and everything kind of coordinates around him. And I start going, I mean, his whole life until he obviously shattered his own illusion or reality that he's in a show. I start going from a young age, if you're uh, you know, training in combat, obviously it trains your skills, but also if you got lucky in so many different battles, you'd start to think you were blessed. You'd start to think a bunch of things to be able to justify why you were just exceptional above the rest, rather than basing it on hard work or things of that sort. So I start going, does that forge a person? The culture around us forges who we are as people. Our moral values, usually you can base it down to your family. Your family's values tend to instill onto you, but also the society that we live in, the areas that we live in tend to shape the person as you grow. So I start wondering, if you live in an age of a period with high knowledge where it's valued more, would you have more people that were thinking maybe that they were more intelligent than others and kind of forming who they were going to become as a person? I mean, it's a dumb theory, but I
No, it's just that it's not a dumb theory. It's just that, of course, the question is always.
Plato had an ego. We know Plato had an ego. Come on.
Yes, that's no doubt. But the point is, if you're talking about a context, then you have to make clear who are you talking about. Of course, the most philosophers, or yes, prominent philosophers in antiquity, were obviously aristocrats, people who had leisure, money, and leisure. That was the case for Plato. Galen was a very rich man from coming from a rich family. So there is, if you're talking about in the ancient world, people were, knowledge or intelligence were praised very highly, and this is why you had more people who are knowledgeable. Or it's a demographic question to some extent, is a social historical question, and of course it's we talk about these things, these ideas, this tradition, as the receivers of a tradition. So we have Plato, we have Aristotle, we have the whole corpus of ancient philosophy, we have the tragedies, we have the epic poems, we have all this stuff. But then, of course, if you think of the multitude of ancient people who existed, and I can't even start, trying to calculate demographically how many ancient people there were around the Mediterranean over 7 centuries, then the question might be, how much would the average farmer, or nobody, or not to talk about women and slaves, know about all these wonderful discoveries? So you have to think, one thing is, again, the tradition that was pretty unique, and of course you can't say that any place in the world has produced the same body of theories, of ideas, of poetry. So one thing is to acknowledge this corpus of stuff that has arrived to us, but on the other hand, to just think that that was a world of wonderful art and philosophy, because as always, the question is, who are you exactly talking about? And the same works for us. I don't know how many people, if you ask, if you do a kind of statistical inquiry, how many people can say something about Plato or ancient medicine, or any question that about history of literature, or philosophy that comes to your mind. It depends on how much knowledge is shared socially, in that sense. So I don't know, if you talk about in that world the knowledge was praised, I don't know to what extent this the fact that in Athens there was a man such as Plato necessarily meant that the average kid was particularly intelligent or knowledgeable, if this is what you were saying. So it's just a distinction that I'm making.
Plato, I mean, even if we took the ideas of what Plato had what I would call probably the first ideas of AI. He had a more magic sense of the answer, of like magic doing these things for us, when we kind of use technology in the more modern day sense. But I mean, those are crazy ideas. And there's stuff where I start looking, like if we're talking about modern things and someone goes, well, actually, this was from this date back here, was a more primitive idea. I start going, either we're all like somehow hitting a cusp of knowledge or intelligence, we're all getting on the same wavelength, and that's just been happening throughout history, but we've been finding a different way to accomplish whatever that idea was, whether it's using technology to do so, whether it's, if you're taking a boat, or if you need to go somewhere to another island or something like that, would you have the idea for an aircraft, or would you have an idea for a boat? I mean, your idea is getting to wherever that destination is, but you're having different ways of technology, or however you're going to get there. So it's like we all have the same goal. It's just interesting to see how the brains I guess, try and solve it. And you get to see, like, when I mentioned Plato's ideas of AI, he had a more magic idea of this sense. And then there's, I mean, obviously theories about people trying to find Atlantis today, but that's because Plato had these crazy descriptions of things where it made it sound so realistic, where it was like, was he coming across something, or what he was experiencing was necessarily real in his reality? And I mean, that gets in a bigger area when it comes into, like, if you're talking about, people's perceptions on things. I mean, if we go back to the beginning with the moral discussion, I mean, people's perception based on their moral value, whether someone looks at somebody a certain way based on ingrained thinking into them. I mean, I'm ranting at this point, but it's just, to me, it's just interesting to see the wavelengths, and you can look at that throughout history. I mean, I mean, the Greeks created our whole literature thing when it comes to the plays, like dramas and comedies and things of that sort. When did it stop being a thing of record keeping, where you're just logging down certain things or historical events or battles, and started to become someone's idea of creating this, I mean, hitting a vein in a sense of finding things that entertain us? I mean, you could take it back to jugglers in court, juggling for the king or something of that sort. But there's this idea out there that started to become that we're going to put on a whole script, a whole play, and people are going to be entertained by this. And to me, I start going, did that, I feel an appetite for people that were maybe dealing with a certain situation where they felt like they were down, maybe they lost a battle, or they, you
Yeah.
know,
I mean, okay, I think again, it's maybe both recording and entertaining are modern. You talk about these two purposes. So you said, when did it stop being a matter of recording and did it start being a matter of entertaining? I think both categories, and also this idea of the sequence, first comes the recording and then the entertaining. There are also somehow modern expectations that we have about cultural productions. I don't think, talking about again Greek antiquity, maybe among the earliest text that we have. I mean, surely the earliest one that traditionally is mentioned is a Homeric poem, so the Iliad and the Odyssey. And there was this much of this interpretation of the poems as having, well, so many different significances in terms of the collectivity of the Greeks, and surely one was a kind of celebration of Greek identity, but also a kind of encyclopedic display of knowledge of different kinds. And there is and there is also the kind of what can you say, the kind of keeping of a tradition of mythological stories about again about well, the different heroic personalities of the ancient world, but also about the Trojan War and the relationship between the Greeks and the populations that were across the Aegean in against which they moved war and so on. So there are purposes there that are if you want a record keeping or the custody of a tradition on the one hand. On the other hand, there is of course the element of entertainment, because entertainment, and what does entertainment means? Means the pleasure of a metrically written poem that has a certain structure and certain poetic recurrences from one place to the other. The fact that it's very beautiful, rich of imagery, rich of similes and nice kind of representations of the natural world. It's also very deep psychologically and existentially, as the reflections, the kind of morals of both the Odyssey and the Iliad is great. Then there is a lot of fabulistic components to them, especially when it comes to the Odyssey, of course, where there is this element of the magic travels and the different places that Odysseus visits. So this is of course entertainment too. Most things can be both a recording and a form of entertaining. Historiography, Herodotus, for example, is surely both an entertaining and a matter of keeping a record of things and celebrating Greek identity, for example, and the exploration of the world around. So there isn't really a clear distinction between these two. An interesting question that you touch on is, what is the definition of entertainment? Because there is an entertainment that is for diversion, getting pleasure out of getting your mind off things and just looking at something that is good music, and that's pure entertainment, if you will. But that's something that makes you think, something that is purposely, comical or stupid. So, it kind of relaxes the mind in this way, or things that talk about things you know already. So you have a pleasure in kind of, gaining this reassurance because things you know about, for example, a traditional story is repeated in a nice way, and you know that you know about the story, you feel a sense of belonging. So all these things and many more belong to entertainment. And I wouldn't say there is a moment where entertainment is born after the need to record or keep, track of things. But I don't think that the two functions are distinguished, if not in a very kind of, at a very, very superficial level, so to say.
Do you think that tackling it from the philosophy angle more than the scientific angle when it comes to studying madness, do you think that that was kind of an early intervention on some issues that were going on back then when it came into the area of madness? I mean, if you put on a play, whether it gets your mind off things, I mean, in a sense, it feeds more of what I would call like the soul aspect of things. Like I said, I'm not religious, but there is this kind of deep thing where it's like, if someone's depressed, it's not necessarily you can take an antidepressant now, but back then it's like, what did you do? You found a way to get your mind off of it.
So interestingly, in tragedy, so in the theater of the fifth century, there is a lot of madness. So this is a question that has been asked very much before. Why in these plays, what we have, there is of course just a small number, but it gives you a good is a good sample, I suppose, of the whole. One could say, how come that there is so much people going crazy? So why is human misfortune, which is a key of tragedy as a genre? So why when things go wrong, people tend to get mad and get mad in a violent way? And how come? And the explanation for this is usually religious or moral or both. So, for example, Orestes, for political family reasons, is feels the need and the desire to kill his own mother because his mother has killed her husband, so his father. And so he does, but then he feels, on the one hand, he had the moral obligation. He felt to avenge his father and kill the mother. On the other hand, the goddesses that represent the mother, so the Furies, haunt him and drive him mad because he had committed this crime against the most sacred blood link, which is the one you have with the mother who, bare you and in her womb and gave
Maternal.
you, and milk. Yes, and so in that, the account for madness in that case is very much it's political, it's religious, and it's moral altogether. And the only way, madness, which is very psychiatric, there is hallucination, there is suffering, there is rambling, and so on. In the play, versions of the plays that we have in different by different authors, it's not really discussed very much medically. It's discussed on these other levels, and these texts are more or less of the same time period as the medical texts. So this doesn't mean that one thing excludes the other. It just means that within what was kind of developing into an almost professional, learned account of madness, these aspects, the religion, the morals, the self-doubt, and so on, are just left out, and they focus more on the physiological part of it. But this doesn't mean that one or the other was not known of, right? It simply meant that the discussions were kept very much separate, and this is maybe the case in in a lot of psychiatric walk-in clinics nowadays too. I don't know how much attention other than pharmacological the average person gets in a kind of walk-in clinic. I don't know, and I don't know the aspect of this, but I think this kind of separation of environments is probably the case in many experiences that are common nowadays too. So it's
This is going to be a dumb question because as a historian, you probably know not to try and put your modern perspective in a past event like that or anything. But I'm asking from researching into the ancient world, were you able to just, I mean, you must have come across some more modern day kind of resemblance of some things. And one, for example, is this idea and still horror plays today, not just plays, but films. Mental health sometimes gets brought in there as well too. Insanity, an insane prisoner. So there are some movies I will not watch, and one is when it does anything with mental health. There's a film that came out that was by M. Night Shyamalan about the grandparents. I think it's called The Visit, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but no, it was too real. Where it was like people that were experiencing sundowning, which is when they're supposed to be sleeping, they're awake and they're walking around the house sleepwalking and doing crazy things. And that's a movie that was not too long ago, a couple of years ago. And then if you take the same maybe different time period, but back in the day with drama plays, I mean, the introduction of insanity into horror. I mean, do you kind of notice the linkage of this fear of things that people really can't understand? I mean, that's a lot of stuff when it comes to our mind. It's like I chopped my arm off. I lost an arm. But what's the mental stuff that you can't see? The things that I'm experiencing that only I can feel, and we try our best to diagnose today. There's still a fear in this idea. It's even if you look at more my like I said, my knowledge can only go back to the Victorian era when it comes to madness. But if you take when they started introducing lobotomies, I mean, there were things that people just didn't understand how to fix. There might have been an overusage of it, but there was a lot of things that people didn't know what to do with. And they said, you guys are the professionals, we'll put this in your care. And getting an ice pick in the eye is not the best thing in the world. But I mean, at that point, it was just like people just don't understand it. Is there more of a fear? And this goes into a little bit darker territory in the history of madness, which is eugenics idea kind of thing of pushing away a problem or isolating the problem away, which is insane asylums and things of that sort. But there's a fear of insanity. There is a fear of madness. And it's like not like every single person might experiencing some one form of madness. You know what I mean? Like everyone can experience depression. You're lucky if you don't experience it once in your life. But there's a fear of like, I don't know whether people envision themselves as that person might be ending up like that or at some sort. But it's just a fear of something we don't understand, which I feel like has been throughout history.
Yes, it's a
That was a long-winded one.
it's about of course I think um, there is a lot of madness in contemporary fiction. I think more than in ancient fiction, especially madness of the chronic, scary, complicated, silent kind. So this is maybe a very modern kind of fear or obsession. So all the madness, for example, that was so much described I said in tragedy as an example, was all of the acute manic kind. So people hallucinating, taking out a sword, killing people, killing themselves, and so on. So this is a typical madness. So it's really a symbolic kind of rebellion against a status quo or the situation one is in, or a kind of, the kind of deal that you've been given and you can't get out of it or change it, then something snaps and there is the mad reaction. So this is the kind of dramatic role that madness has in tragedy. It's not of the kind of, melancholic, long-term, thoughtful kind of madness that you have. Now, when it comes to I mean, it's a very good question about modern fiction or modern, mentalities. How come that there is this interest, this fascination, and also morbid fear and interest at the same time with again the serial killer, the stalker, the neighbor who looks so good, and instead the things that happen in darkness and things that you can't see but are there. This is, yeah, a very modern kind of insecurity, I would say. So it is about things you don't understand, but then again, you don't understand also why Ajax in a Greek tragedy becomes mad and starts killing people. In fact, killing cows and sheep, thinking that he's killing people, so also making a fool of himself. You don't understand why he's doing that, but it's a very visible, very extreme act. Um, this is what you find there, and so the fascination is because it's difficult to understand. But the question is why this interest and this fascination with the invisible, the creepy, as in something that creeps slowly in the dark and and develops through years. The discovery about the roots of this in someone's childhood and so on. These are very, these very much belong to modernities. They have to do probably with psychoanalysis for sure, and this kind of idea of the human mind or human beings as enigmas with very ancient roots, whether historically or personally. This idea that you are the product of very deep forces that are rooted in ancient past, in your own childhood, or even transgenerationally and so on. This is a very yeah, I suppose very very modern obsession or insecurity. You don't have anything like that in plays not played in this way in ancient stuff. So there are two different kinds of fear, I would say. But yes, madness, I mean, keep being in the middle in one way or another.
Do you think
Yeah.
it's because they haven't experienced what maybe the more modern sense of tragedy or maybe the more modern sense of like things that go scary in the night is because they really hadn't like I don't know if it was time or if it was creative influences, because back then they were very creative. And I would have to think that, I mean, if you got to funnel whatever your pain somewhere sometimes, whether you're experiencing pain or whether you have to feel like you have to be a little bit insane to make creative work sometimes. And I started feeling like, I mean, look back then. I mean, I don't think everybody was being diagnosed as insane, but I feel like they were putting their ideas, and a lot of their ideas that would maybe get called insane today were being funneled into something creative that we call like myth or things of this sort. And I'm not obviously shooting down religion at all. I'm just saying, like, if you look at today's kind of ideas of what fears us is problems that we experience probably more than they were able to diagnose back then, or problems they didn't have back then. I mean, back then it was like dying from a wild animal. Okay, a werewolf film plays. I mean, you're still dying by a wild animal, but it's probably not the same thing as what they were afraid of back then. But then you have battles, you have wars, and the same common linkages, which is people losing something, whether it's a family member or whether it's just something that you own being taken from you. You know, that's a big fear for a lot of people. It's still a common fear today as well, too. People get angry over things of that sort. I mean, war is another one that's a common linkage as well, too.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I just think it's you know, and it's
I'm trying to find linkages because there's like an existential crisis today where it's like everyone's like, who am I? And I'm like, it's because like we don't know too much about our past. So I feel like if you look into the past a little bit, you'll see like, oh, people experience the same problems for a long time. Maybe not necessarily like the same isolated location spots, but like these conflicts
yes, I
within
think the
self.
problems might have been the same. I think what is very typical, more than me not having been there before, but rather, sometimes it's useful to try and define what is specific, or to the way we think of ourselves. Things like identity, for example, or the depth of one's mind, of one's experiences as building up into the kind of it's a simplification, but the kind of psychoanalytical Freudian view of your mind as something, as the kind of dynamic product of a set of experiences and examples and dynamics that you absorb you are very young. This kind of idea that there is a depth to the individual person that is worth paying a lot of attention to. For example, this idea of identity, of the unicity of the single person, in terms of this is not only in psychoanalytical quarters but also trivialized in kind of aspects of our culture. You are worth it, or you are unique, or follow your heart, your answer is inside yourself, all these kind of things which mean everything and nothing, in the sense that you have to understand them starting from an idea that the unicity of the person, or the identity of the person, is such an important part, the key to understand the whole world, right? This kind of existential uh, again, celebration of the I, the subjective point of view, as the starting point. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying it's very different, and it's very specific to our own culture, to the point that we don't notice it anymore. It's like a thing that commonly we think it's a good thing to teach a child, for example. Don't be yourself, follow your instinct, or in this kind of celebrations of the depth and unicity of the individual person. So, of course, the way of mental health and mental illnesses are conceived is very much dependent on something like this. Now, the idea that it comes through a personal set of expectations and qualities.
Did you ever come across anybody through reading any ancient text, maybe a specific person that wrote down anything that was a little bit different than all the others? I would have to think, I mean, there's a thing where I think is important. It's also can be a very dangerous thing as well too, which is spending time with your thoughts. I mean, hopefully you have good thoughts, but it's also not good to be alone 100% of the time, all the time. That can kind of drive yourself insane a little bit. So I start wondering, I mean, critical thinking, not critical thinking, but just spending time inside your mind, writing down in a journal has been something that a lot of my generation and younger generations, and I think even before me were doing as well too. But writing things down, you start to carve out not only problems in your life or things that you're experiencing and feelings, but I also feel like it develops your thoughts in a way and kind of evolves you as a person as well. And I'm curious if anybody had any writings that were maybe different from the rest, that maybe had an understanding of things that kind of they were you could see a common evolution of it. You know what I mean? Like amongst that person and maybe their text from the beginning to the end.
Well, there is a lot of I mean, every text is unique in its own way, if you will. So it's difficult. I cannot think of any text that we would say. this was extraordinary compared to all the others. They're all also because, again, we don't have, we have a lot of ancient literature, but not quite so much if you think of the much or how much was lost. So we have in somehow patchy impressionistic, representation of whatever was written, and somehow, it's difficult to kind of think of a norm and then single out one or two texts that were extraordinary in that sense. But yes, maybe yes. I mean, I wouldn't.
Because I get interested in Leonardo da Vinci's lost works, where I'm like, I would pay anything to try and find his lost works. I don't know. Nobody knows where they are. I mean, we keep coming up with new
Many
paintings,
people
and
would, I think.
so it's like, what was he experiencing? If you could have a journal of like his stuff, writing down his thoughts and things of that sort, just to be able to step inside the mind of a person. I mean, he spent a lot of time alone as well too, even though he had a couple of accomplices or students, but brief amount of times between them. But there's a lot of time where you start wondering, like, just getting inside somebody's head, being able to form out your own opinions. What were they thinking, and how were they thinking differently? I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, no, it would be wonderful. But again, the genre of diary keeping, so to say, was not came out fairly late in antiquity. I think one of the first maybe proper example that we have of something like this is the so-called the sacred hierologos, or sacred discourses, I don't remember how it's translated, of Aelius Aristides. This is a nice psychopathological, if you will, case, because this is a guy who was an orator, so an intellectual, someone who could, like a lawyer, but in terms of writing speeches, so a very educated, very rich man who had a kind of frail health, and he was going a lot, he knew a lot about medicine. And he was also going a lot to the temple of Asclepius, so someone who put together both knowledge of medicine at the time and a religious interest in the cult of Asclepius, and kind of trying to forge a personal relationship with the god who would give him advice about how to cure himself. And he kept a kind of diary. Maybe you can look for if you want and read it, because it's very interesting. Although the guy is a bit insufferable at times. I mean, he's a kind of hypochondriac and self-obsessed, maybe slightly narcissistic personality, talking a lot about describing his state of health, and then what he is in very, in detail, in clinical detail, is very precise, and then talking about his relationship with the god and the kind of therapeutical measures he would be recommended and try, and whether they worked or not, and so on and so on. So yes, this is one example of one extraordinary text that I think give you some insight into the mind of a person, but then again, to be taken with a certain caution, in the sense that the mind of a person is always a mystery, and especially when you read someone's diary, fictional diary, that's where you can be more sure that the person is even more cooking up a version of the truth to appear in a certain way or in another. So access to the mind of others is well, of course, difficult in writing, in person, and this is just how things are. But this is one example of a first person writing that would be an answer to your question.
It sounds unbearable, but I would love to read the journal of a hypochondriac.
Yeah, no,
That sounds funny.
they are short passages, so you can go through it. I
I
think.
mean, I know the person is probably experiencing a whole different thing in his head, but I can just picture someone writing down, like, and maybe I should go to the local, like, as they're in the middle of a thought. And I'm just like, dang, he's writing it down on paper too. That's crazy. But Chiara, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I enjoyed this conversation very much. If you have a place where people can find any of your links and you want to promote them real quick, and then I'll make sure I link them in the description as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, let me know.
No, just you say off your links, like your website, and then people can.
Okay. Yes, I send it to you. I thought you were going to send me the link. Yes, okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description once you send them to me. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.